Now, so just to start from the beginning, if we're thinking about conceptual engineering, can you see that okay or not? Is that okay? Yes? Okay, sweet. If we're thinking about conceptual engineering, then we're probably going to be thinking about at least two things. That's concepts and meanings. And I think that those should be treated separately. Concepts are mental representations, and meanings are, properties of words or other linguistic items. And so, psychology studies one, linguistics studies the other. Yes, they do have some back and forth, but I think it's important for philosophers to recognize that these are two separate things, and conceptual engineering needs to be addressing them independently unless it's otherwise, not relevant for the kind of project that's being undertaken. Okay, so when we think about concepts and meanings, a natural thing to think about is, what are these things? Well, one way to think about them is as extensions. That's a fairly basic way to think about them. Another way to think about them as intensions, functions from possible worlds to extensions, perhaps. That's a more complex way to think about them in a nice way in natural language semantics, for example. But if we want to go beyond the intention, right, and intentions are, they have well-known problems and limitations, then we might think of something like a sense, a Phrygian sense. And if we're going to think about something like Phrygian senses, then that would naturally lead us into analyticity. So this is, conceptual engineering is I never know what to call it. Maybe it's a movement. I call it a movement. Maybe that's stupid, but whatever. It's some element of analytic philosophy for the most part. Now, of course, there's plenty of people who are continental philosophers who are interested in conceptual engineering, but it's for the most part, most of the work has been taking place in analytic philosophy, and that's the branch of Western philosophy named after the method of analysis, which is tied closely to analyticity. When you do the method of analysis, you produce analytic claims or analyses of important philosophical concepts. For example, knowledge is justified true belief. Now, I'm convinced by many of the criticisms of analyticity that have shown up in the history of analytic philosophy that there are no analytic truths in the sense of, sentences that are true purely in virtue of the meanings of the words involved. And I'm roughly convinced by, considerations like those found in Quine, Davidson, and more recently, Timothy Williamson. So for those of you who aren't super familiar with his Conceptual Truths paper, Williamson introduces the Aristotelian conspiracy theorist example, which is a spectacular example to get you kind of softened up into the mood of thinking that, well, maybe somebody could reject the claim that all vixens are vixens in a coherent way without, thereby, having to be thought of as irrational or something like that. So I'm convinced that analyticity is not going to do a very good job of making sense of, the concepts and meanings that conceptual engineers are engaging with. And so one thing that you could do here is to introduce something better than analyticity, constitutive principles. Constitutive principles behave kind of like analyticity. They constitute the meanings or the senses of the words or the concepts in question, but they're also weaker than analyticity. So for example, they can turn out to be false, and you don't have to believe them in order for your words to mean what they mean. They don't have the meta-semantic, meaning conferring role that analyticity or analytic sentences were taken to have by many of their proponents. So constitutive principle, you might think like, well, okay, great, Kev, but what's left? Well, what's left is a simple idea, which is that a principle is constitutive for some word. If in the conversation you're having with somebody, when someone raises the negation of that principle, that's a pro tanto reason for you to think that you don't mean the same thing as that person. So if in a conversation with you, I say, hey, I got a new pet dog right here. See my new pet dog, right? At that point, you're going to go, Kevin doesn't mean what I mean by dog. Now, that's a reasonable thing. Maybe I do mean what you mean by a dog, and I just have really freaky beliefs about dog, you know? That's possible. So these kinds of considerations can be overridden, but it's a default, you know, like I said, pro tanto reason for thinking that we don't mean the same thing. Okay. So now with constitutive principles, we can do lots of good things like characterize meanings and concepts, and we can also provide criteria for conceptual engineering. So for example, if we think of a meaning or a concept as determined by its constitutive principles, then we can think of replacement as the process of determining which of those constitutive principles we want to keep and which ones we want to jettison for the process of, you know, arriving at a new concept. So I felt good about constitutive principles here. Notice the past tense, because what I'm raising today is a problem for myself and for other folks, but it's a problem that I have a grip on what I want to say about it, but I don't have a fully worked out, satisfying solution that will make it stop chattering away in my head as a problem, right? So I haven't shut it up yet, but I've started the process of trying to get that problem to be quiet in my head. So the problem that Patrick Greenough raised, which is the Omnicide problem, is a problem for constitutive principles. And it's a problem for my particular view on constitutive principles in the Replacing Truth book. So what's the problem? Well, the problem is this: if we replace any one concept, then it is of course connected to other ones by constitutive principles. And so if we replace one concept, then we end up replacing the ones that are connected to it by constitutive principles, and the ones that are connected to those, and the ones that are connected to those. And so we can never replace any one of our concepts without replacing all of them, the Omnicide problem. So that does seem like a nasty problem, one that you would surely want to avoid. I wanted to avoid it in the context of our interaction, and I felt like I had a really nice solution to this problem. Now, here's the solution I gave. The solution is to think that, and this isn't an ad hoc solution, this was the original view, it just wasn't really appreciated in the objection. The idea is that constitutive principles are relative to a word. So it's not the case, like with analyticity, that a sentence is either analytic or it's not. You know, it's not like that. It's that a principle can be constitutive for one of the words in it and not others. So for example, you know, green is a color. You know, that seems like a constitutive principle. If I was in a conversation with somebody and they said, hey, guess what, Kev, you know what? Green's not a color. You know, at that point, I'm going to think, well, you know, you probably don't mean what I mean by green or color, you know, one of these words here. Now, it's not constitutive for is. No, that doesn't make me think, well, you don't mean what I mean by is. You know, of course, I just take that for granted. Now, maybe you don't mean what I mean by is, but that's not a reason for me to think that that's the case. So what I wanted to say is constitutive principles are relative to words. And so I can introduce, if we think about the situation with truth here, I can introduce new concepts, ascending truth and descending truth. And I can define them in terms of concepts that we already have, without thereby making them relinquish their constitutive connections to other principles. Because these connections here are constitutive for descending truth, but not constitutive for this guy. So this guy doesn't change. This guy is connected constitutively to concepts that we already have, but that doesn't thereby change the concepts we already have, because these principles are not assumed to be constitutive for those. These are assumed to be constitutive for these guys. It's these connections that constitute the meanings of these new words, these new concepts that I'm recommending people should use in place of truth only in certain circumstances. For example, when you're doing the semantics for an expressively rich language and there are liar, paradox, nastinesses around, you want to try to avoid that sort of thing. Otherwise, you end up contradicting yourself no matter what you say. Is my talk done? No, because I don't think that that's the end of the story. I think that that was a nice kind of response. Yeah, great. I kind of patted myself on the back after I gave that response and I thought I was done with it, but I'm not, because here's the problem. The problem, and I kind of struggle a little bit about what to call this problem. I tried to think, maybe it's should be called the integration problem, but integration in the United States has this horrible connotation to it. And I thought maybe assimilation problem. I think assimilation is probably a bad term for it, but I think maybe we should call it the incorporation problem. And the problem is, you might be able to notice, once we end up with constitutive principles going the other direction, if this ends up successful enough that these guys start to be defined in terms of the new ones, well, now we're back in trouble, because now, and it only takes one, now this guy is changed because it's got a new constitutive principle. And so everything that's connected to it is going to have a new constitutive principle effectively, because the concept represented there is going to have changed or different. There's a different one there. So the worry then is, yeah, this reply works until these new concepts start to be incorporated into the meanings or definitions of the rest of them. As long as the new concepts just sit on top of your conceptual scheme without influencing it, okay, then you're fine. But once those new concepts start influencing the old ones, now Omnicide problem comes back. Feel it? All right, so what to say about this? I want to make sure that it's really clear. So I want to go through the example with truth in a little bit of detail. So what am I on time? That's cool. What did I sorry, the 20 past? I've been talking for 18 minutes. That's fine. All right. So with the situation with truth, let's be a little bit more specific here. So truth is connected to a lot of other concepts. It's one of the most centrally connected, concepts in, one of the most centrally connected philosophically relevant concepts that you can investigate. And so, in the book, in the Replacing Truth book, I did a whole chapter looking at, how to tie ascending truth and descending truth into the concepts that are connected to truth in such a way that would provide additional, content or structure, meaning, understanding for the reader for the ascending and descending truth words. Now, some of those are, knowledge was one of them, meaning is another one, reference is another one, belief, right, keeps going. And so, I wanted to say that, ascending truth and descending truth are connected to each of these guys down here. That is, they have constitutive principles that invoke these concepts, and those principles are constitutive for descending truth and for ascending truth, not constitutive for meaning and belief and all these other things, right? No one's going to say, oh, you don't think that ascending true propositions can be believed? Well, you must not mean what I mean by belief then, right? No one's going to say that, because ascending truth and descending truth are the ones that are defined in terms of belief. No one has integrated ascending and descending truth so much that they're changing what they mean by belief, right? That hasn't happened yet, as if it's going to, right? So one of the things that I wanted to emphasize here is the connection to meaning. So yeah, truth and meaning are super connected. The meaning of a sentence is the conditions under which it's true. Great. But I wanted to say, look, the if we introduce this new theory here, that the meaning of a sentence is the conditions under which it's ascending true and the conditions under which it's descending true. If you want to introduce something like that as a new account of meaning, great, and that's what I do in the book. So that's the view. But then imagine if that theory were to be adopted by enough people, and then assume a position of importance, of such centrality in the way that they think about meaning, that this claim itself goes from being just a theory to being constitutive of meaning. If that happens, Omnicide is back, because now we have a new constitutive principle for meaning. And so we don't really have meaning. Now we've got meaning star here. And meaning is, of course, connected to reference. And so reference is going to be, not in terms of meaning, but meaning star. And so now we get reference star. And you can see the problem rippling through the entire conceptual scheme. Okay. So what to do about it? Here's what I think is the right thing to do about it. The right thing to do about it is just admit it. Yeah, that's right. That's what happens. But it's not a philosophically significant objection. It's not a philosophically important objection because these processes occur over time. And so it's not the kind of thing that should serve as an objection to the philosophical thesis that concepts and conceptual engineering are or should be set up in this way. The claim that conceptual engineering should be done in the way that I advocate does result in an omnicide problem. It does. But the problem is a slow motion problem. It's not a problem for the theory. It's so what am I doing today? I'm pulling it's a feature, not a bug move, which we're all familiar with. It's not our most favorite move, obviously, because it's a sort of a desperate move, but it's a move, and I think here it's actually enlightening. And so I wanted to spend the rest of the brief bit of time that I have with you talking about, or hoping to convince you that this is an illuminating sort of discovery rather than a crushing objection. So when we think about, I want to have something a bit more abstract here. And so what if instead we have a situation like this, where we have A and B and C and D. And let's say A is defined in terms of B and C. So those are constitutive principles. And B has a constitutive principle going back to A, and C has a constitutive principle going to D. Now, remember, those are just one-way arrows. They don't go the other direction. And so then let's imagine a conceptual engineering move. Stop using D, right? D is defective, or it goes against social justice, or it's so unclear that it causes so much confusion that it's not worth it, or whatever. Now we have a problem, because so here's the time. At time 1, we say no D. Okay, well, but now at time 2, we realize, well, crap, C is defined in terms of D. Every time you start trying to think, well, someone asks you, well, what's a C? Maybe you use C, fine, but someone tries to ask you about how to explain it, and you think, you keep trying to say D, but you realize, no, I shouldn't be saying D. So maybe we need a new one here, right? We need a new C star. And then we recognize, oh, brutal. A is defined in part in terms of C. And so at step 3, we recognize we need a new A. We'll get that to be A star. then eventually it ramifies over to B, and finally at step 4, a new B star. And because of the one conceptual engineering move, stop using D, that has, in an omnicide way, ramified throughout our entire scheme and required the definition of an entirely new scheme, plank by plank. Yeah, so there's a sort of you know mereological worry here about, is it really a new scheme? But it doesn't really matter. If it's got all new concepts in the scheme, then that's bad enough. Or is it? Now, here's what I want to invite you to do. Imagine you focus only on this time right here, capital T. Now, at capital T, we have C star, but we don't have A star, right? We're changing. The effect is moving this way, but it hasn't actually hit A and B yet. And so a person living at this time, understanding that these processes can take a while, this time might last for a while. And that would be a time period at which you would be willing to say, I don't use D, D's not in my vocabulary. And as a result, I've got this new concept, C, but I still use A and I still use B. And if you ask me to explain A, I'm going to be at least tempted, or I'm going to have a disposition to explain it in terms of C, not C prime, not C star, but C. So there's an irrationality in me in some way. The concepts I'm using and the claims I'm making about them aren't entirely coherent, because there's this incoherency that's working its way through this change that's working its way through the scheme. It hasn't worked its way all the way through. Okay, so in logic, when we think about belief revision, there's a really common assumption that people make, which is the assumption about omniscience, right? That we know all the logical consequences of our beliefs, and we clearly don't. We're not logically omniscient. What I want to draw your attention to here is a different assumption: omnipotence, logical omnipotence, the ability to change your beliefs in a sort of instantaneous way as a result of finding some inconsistency or making some change. Clearly we're not logically omnipotent either. And then I want to invite you to think about these categories, but for concepts instead. Are we logically omniscient with respect to our concepts or conceptual scheme? No. And the point I'm making here today is we're not logically omnipotent with respect to conceptual change either. So the take-home message here, I think, is something like the following. If you're worried about conceptual engineering and you feel the pull of the Omnicide problem, and you think that a relativized account, I'm pointing at something that used to be there but it's not there anymore, and you think a relativized account of constitutive principles is a good way to deal with the Omnicide problem, then you also need to make sure that you are explicitly denying logical omnipotence with respect to changes in our conceptual scheme. So I feel like, an analogy here to leave you with, for the end, it would be something like the following. There's these spectacular experiment in physics. We've got these two kind of dueling experiments between the Large Hadron Collider and the gravity wave detector, right? So the Large Hadron Collider is working in particle physics, and the gravity wave detector is working in cosmology, and there's this sort of battle between them. But the gravity wave detector is what I want you to think about. This is an amazing piece of machinery, and it can identify events that happened back in time simply by clocking and tracking the disturbances that those events created in space-time, the disturbances that move outward through space-time. This machine can identify these disturbances and use them to say, oh, this is a gravity wave, and it was created by this collision between two black holes, a certain number of years ago and a certain number of light years away. Now, what I want you to do is imagine that these kinds of conceptual changes are slowly working their way through each of our conceptual schemes. So almost certainly, all of us have waves of disturbance, of conceptual disturbance, working their way through our conceptual schemes right now. All of us are in this position, position T, halfway through or partially through a process of change. Now, it doesn't seem like that to us, but we know that that's the case. And so if it were, one of the things that I wanted to emphasize is, we'll probably, if you start looking at these kinds of inconsistencies or these kinds of incoherences, then you could use them to track previous conceptual changes in the way that the gravity wave detector detects previous events by looking at the way those events causally affect and ripple out from their origins. All right, so what I've talked about today is conceptual engineering in general. I've talked about my truth project. I've talked about a problem that Patrick Greenough raised for it called the Omnicide problem. I gave you a rundown of my earlier reply to it, also why I felt like it was inadequate, and then the kind of bigger, softer, less satisfying reply to the beefed up Omnicide problem that I've presented to you today, really for the first time. So that's it for me. Thanks very much. I really appreciate your attention, and welcome concepts about any aspect of what I've discussed so far or whatever else you want to chat about. So yeah, thanks.